Welcome to 818. We're not new here. We spent years sifting through the older corners of the web. Places most people have forgotten. Threads, posts, and whispers that vanish unless someone keeps them alive. That's what we do. We're not here to convince you of anything. We won't tell you what to believe. We'll just tell you the stories, exactly as written. And tonight, we're starting with a classic. The Smiling Man. A story that's been passed around for years, but still manages to unsettle. Think of this as easing you in. The deeper archives will come soon enough.
The Smiling Man. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I'd often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers were friendly in the city. But all of that changed in just a few minutes on one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police patrol park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance walking and headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalks pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realised how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky, and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still until I could make out his face. His eyes were open, wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street, and as I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He'd stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I'd put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He'd crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I'd looked away for him no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved very fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to ask was, "What the f*** do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper. What the f... Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there, smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around, very slowly, and started dance walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough away to almost be out of sight. And then I realised something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side of the road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see his stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see.
And that was The Smiling Man. A story that's simple, but disturbing in the way it lingers. Because we've all walked home at night and felt that sudden unease, like someone's watching. But sometimes it isn't just a feeling. Our next story takes us deep into the woods. Two friends on the back roads in the mountains, all alone, or so they thought. This is The Tent in the Trees.
The Tent in the Trees. This story takes place in August of 2013 in the mountains of southern Oregon. I'm a USAF, Security Forces Airman, military police. My girlfriend was at work, and as a swelteringly hot day began to turn into thunderstorms, my buddy Nick, another military cop, and I decided to go explore some back roads and get out of the heat in town. Southern Oregon is crisscrossed with logging roads, some actively used and many totally forgotten and grown over. Nick and I spent many of our days off starting on roads that we knew, finding roads we didn't know, driving for hours into the mountains, eventually navigating back to paved roads. On this particular day, with storm clouds building over the mountains, we set off on a road we had never been on and began the drive into the mountains. After driving for around an hour, we hadn't seen nor heard any signs of other people in the woods. We rounded a bend in the thick fir woods and emerged in a meadow that was totally surrounded by thick aspen groves. The meadow was perfectly flat and eerily still. We both noticed the strange stillness almost immediately. No birds, hardly any insect noise, no squirrels, certainly no other people. On the far side of the meadow, right at the edge of the tree line, there was a picnic table. The table was very odd, however. It was painted bright orange and much larger than a typical picnic table in a park. Remarking on this, Nick drove through the meadow to get a closer look. I remember being apprehensive as we approached. The whole scenario was exceptionally strange. The overall silence of the aspen grove was unsettling. Also, it was nearly impossible to see far into the trees as aspens grew extremely close together. When we were parked by the table, I hopped out of the passenger seat of the truck to check it out. I'm not very tall, only about 5'5". Regardless, the table was ridiculously oversized and practically unusable. The seats were nearly at chest level, meaning I'd have to climb up to even sit on them. I was looking at the table. Nick called me over to the truck, and I noticed he was looking back into the aspens. At first I couldn't see what he was looking at, but then I noticed a splash of colour that was completely out of the place in the thick trees. A small one-man tent was back in the trees, about 50 feet from the strange table. I had an initial feeling of dread, and felt certain that there was someone in the tent, and if we could see the tent, they could see us. There were no campgrounds in the area, no people, no main roads for miles. Surely, someone camping so remotely would be at the very least a strange person. However, as we observed the tent, we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds coming from it. Nick suggested I call out. I didn't want to, but I did. "Hey, anyone in there?" I yelled. No reply. Feeling completely on edge, Nick and I thought about driving away and leaving this strange area, but we began to fear the worst. What if there was a body in the tent? What if someone had got kidnapped? Foolish, I know, but we thought it all the same. After some debate, we decided to have Nick turn the truck around to drive away from the camp. Should we need to leave in a hurry, he'd be waiting behind the wheel. With my heart pounding, I started walking through the trees toward the tent. I was totally keyed up with senses on full alert. When I reached the campsite, Several things struck me as odd. Backpacks were scattered all over. No fire had been built, no wood collected. The tent was literally full of backpacks and women's clothing. A feel of dread. I turned to leave and tell Nick what I'd seen. As I left, I heard Nick start yelling, "Let's go, let's get the f*** out of here!" Not knowing why he was yelling, I ran back to the truck. When I broke out of the trees, I saw a beat-up old Ford Taurus on the road, blocking us from leaving the meadow. I immediately leapt into the passenger seat and Nick floored the gas pedal. The car was occupied by 2 men. A third person was lying against the window in the back. As he drove across the meadow, the driver attempted to block us from the road, but Nick drove around them and accelerated the way we'd come. I looked back and saw the car attempting to turn around on the narrow road. Nick drove like a madman, and though I was honestly terrified that they'd catch up, we hit the highway without seeing the car again. I still do not know if the person in the back was male or female. I called the state police, and they promised to send a trooper out to check out the scene. However, I received a call the next day from a trooper stating the campsite, the backpacks, the women's clothes, all gone, though we could tell people had been in the area. The strange table was still by the thick aspen grove. I've not returned to the area, and I don't intend to.
That was the tent in the trees. The city has its dangers, but the wilderness does too. And sometimes, the people you meet out there are far worse than what your imagination thinks is in the shadows of the forest. We'll be back with more soon. Deeper threads, older archives, stranger stories. But for now, sleep tight.